Well, I guess it's me now, so good morning, everyone. I did a bit of provocational teasing yesterday night because I was hoping you would wake up early and read the papers that were supporting the lecture. So I hope this is what you did. And I have quite a long lecture, I think, I don't know, we'll see. And then we'll have a discussion because, as I said, what I will try to do, well, actually, I think it's interesting because I think my conclusion will be more or less the same as Jeffrey Checon's. Although we don't know each other, I think he never read what I wrote, what I write, and I know his book exists, but I don't use it. And I think it's just because we belong to very different, kind of backgrounds, so we don't have the same reference. We have friends in common. So I know about what he's doing. But again, I was really struck yesterday afternoon. I was really interested to listen to him because I think we have exactly the same conclusion. And he told you that his conclusion were a bit of a problem for you because you are doing a PhD in 3 years, 4 years maximum. And what he wants you to do is to do something different from what you're actually doing. And things that actually would be more time-consuming than 3 years, probably. And I share his feelings. So my aim is more, first, to tell you about works that exist. A lot of qualitative work on European identity, or so-called European identity, because most of them actually conclude that the concept is a false one, but which actually try to go in greater depth into this question of affective feelings toward European integration. And I want you to know that it exists. I went through most of your papers. I didn't read them precisely, but I went through them just to see about the references. And apart from Diez Medrano, I think most of the people who belong to what I call the qualitative term, you don't use them. Especially Jonathan White, and I will take some time about Jonathan White's work because I think it's exceptional. I think it was really brave because he was a guy doing his PhD at the European Institute in Florence, and he really was brave enough to try to challenge the idea. If I, ask about people about what matters to them, will they ever mention Europe? So I think it was brave to do it, and I think his book is really, really interesting, and it's really rephrasing completely the question of European demos. So I think it's important. So I want you to know about this. And then I'm not sure you can really use this stuff so much, or at least do what I would like you to do and what Jeff Checon said you should do within your PhD. But I want you to remember, if you become an academic and if you get a position, then I want you to remember that. And then when you are free to do whatever you want to do, then please come back to this lecture, go back to the references and see what you want to do. And this is really my aim. So first of all, thank you to the organizers of this Young Scholars Forum. I really think it's a good idea, and I was very happy to be invited. And so I will remain until Thursday. So if what I say now is, again, too much of a provocation and you don't want to discuss it just afterwards, we can do it tomorrow or not the day before because I will leave just after the panel. Yes, I said it's a provocation because let me phrase exactly what the provocation is. So what I really think and what I will try to explain to you is that European identity is a false concept. It's pushed forward by the European Commission and by promoters of European integration with lots of money. If you do the math, it's more than 100 million that were invested in the 7th framework just to fund a project on European identity. 100 millions of euros just in this project. And with the collaboration of social scientists gathered in European studies. This concept, according to me, prevents us to look and see what is at stake in citizens' reaction towards integration. So I think we have to stop playing this game. We have to renounce using Eurobarometer data, at least in a positive way, meaning with testing already existing theories. Go for interpretative approaches that address theory building in an inductive way and stop focusing on the EU. but on the contrary, open the spectre or widen the angle and put European integration in the context of the general transformation of the global political system. So that's my opinion about European studies and European identity. So again, I know it's a provocation. I could, in another context, I was in Mainz last week. I was in a panel with people doing, let's say, Marxist approach to European integration, and I more or less defended the opposite position, meaning what is in your papers, because they were all convinced, but we were a very small number of people, only actually women, apart from one guy, and clearly we were not in the mainstream study. So I could then be more or less in defense of positivist thoughts about European integration. But having not read, but look through your papers, I think what you need is this kind of discourse. So this is what I will try to do. Contrary to Jeffrey Chekon, I will use a PowerPoint presentation mainly because of the language, because I know my pronunciation might be misleading. So if you see the words, you have a better chance to understand what I want to say. Okay. So first, qualitative methods or techniques, is that what matters? My task was to tell you about qualitative research, qualitative work. So the title of my session is Qualitative Methods 1. So this afternoon you will have qualitative method 2. And actually, up to last week, I truly believe that qualitative methods matters, and it makes a difference from using quantitative methods. Also, I did quantitative work for quite a long time, and some of you, or quite a lot of you, refer to my work, but it's always my Eurobarometer studies that are quoted, so you don't know about the other stuff. But again, last week, with this Marxist girlfriend from European Studies, the discussion was against, well, to rephrase the qualitative-quantitative divide, and I think they were right. And I think the problem is not about qualitative and quantitative, but about inductive and interpretive approach, which is exactly what Chekon said yesterday, in contrast to, or in opposition to, a positivist approach. And we will go back to, I think it was Marco's question yesterday about how we combine the two, because I think it's very, very important. So I think, second, there is a postulate. I think it's European integration is a work in progress. And I think we all agree with that, which is really important. Laura yesterday was playing between, and it's always very complicated, should we use nationalism studies in order to look at European integration? We know if we do that, it's problematic because we are in a different historical context and we don't want to say that Europe is supposed to become a national state. But at the same time, we tend to use it. And I'm more convinced by people, by the famous blind man and the elephant. I'm more convinced by this idea that we actually don't know what we should use as a theory. European integration is something going on. We have no idea if this is just an intermediary phase and going to some kind of global order, global political system, if this is just a temporary period of backlash and we will go back to nationalism and nation states. Quite a lot of study at the moment say that this is a backlash and we are going back to national states and to more national power in the world. We don't know if we are really constructing something new, a new kind of democracy. We have no idea. So I think this is really the most important thing to keep in your mind and say, okay, you have to be innovative. You have to have new ideas because we don't know. So we have to find ways to look at something, but we don't know where and we don't know what. And I think at least we all agree on that, even people doing the kind of work I, for the moment, think is not what we should do. Okay. The third point is, this is where I will, so I told you, we'll try to really lecture you on what I call the qualitative term of European studies. People like, not so much Diez Medrano, but Adrian Favel, most importantly, a French team from Daniel Gaxi and his colleagues, but I know Cyril, who is very critical of their work, so maybe he might tell you about why. And Jonathan White, which has, who I think is a very important author, and our work, which I presented briefly yesterday, and I will go back to that at the end. So there was an accumulation. So I will really try to give you some reference points, and I think in the few papers papers you were supposed to read for the lecture, you already have a series of references. And again, what I will try to do is to claim for an inductive approach that we will discuss, I hope, in the second part of the discussion of the session, after the break. Okay, so the outline. The problem is, if we discuss European identity or European identification, I first need to tell you what is my own conception about European identification. And here I have another provocation, and I know it's a provocation for most, but for some of you who are social psychologists in the room, I know there are a few of you. And anyway, even if you are not from social psychology, I think in all the paper, you all refer to social identity theory. I think it's wrong. I really think it's an error to import from from psychology a concept and then to use it to address the question of European identification and national identity, which I think is the same. Identification with a political system or with a territory governed by a political system is a question of power. And power is not in social identity theory. So there is a question of having one sense of oneself which is good or not good and compare with others. But what it is about national identification and European identification is how you identify with a people, meaning with a group of people, with a group of persons whose aim is the auto-government. It's the self-government, sorry. I told you I have language problem issues. So I think it's what matters in these issues and is the relationship between the people and not always discussing the question of the in and the out group discussion, which is what you will find in all papers using social identity theory. It's always the question of the balance between the in and the out, between the we and the others. Okay, it matters, and I would refer to the discussion yesterday night with Caesarian citizenship. Okay, it matters, but what matters, and the question at the end was, would it be enough just to use threat and build a we against another? It would not be enough, because what you need is a we where people can mobilize, can participate. And if you look at sociological work, you will see that if people go to vote, it's because they identify with their nation. It's because they identify with the group of people which is voting together. If you just have the threat, you have just apathy, and you don't have democracy. So what we need is a concept, an identity concept, which could use us, which is really within the question of the power structure and relationship, and which is, well, useful to, again, address power issues. If I am not clear, please do not hesitate to tell me. I know my English is a problem, so please stop me and I will try to be clear. So I was, in the first part of the presentation, try to give you my understanding of what should be a useful concept of identification and identity. Second, I will tell you about the qualitative term, and I will begin with Diaz Medrano from Europe and with political allegiance after European integration, which is Jonathan White's book. Then, very briefly, because it's more or less what I told you yesterday, I will tell you how, according to me, we can now solve this puzzle that was generated by this qualitative term, and then I will go to through the few requirements to do new research on European identity. So, the first question, why we should, well, not why we should stop with social identity theory. So I think I made my point, but I'm sure we will go back to that in the discussion, and it's fine. But what do we use, and what do I use as a concept in order to search European identity or European identification? I use a Charles Tilly definition of identities. You certainly read or heard of Brubaker's and Cooper's paper in 2001 called Beyond Identity, where Brubaker and Cooper have a very extensive and sharp discussion about the uses of the identities, notion of identity, and say, well, we should stop using it because it mixes everything, and we should now have more precise, specific points that we should inquire. And Charles Tilly, and I guess you've heard about Charles Tilly because I think he's one of the most famous sociologists of, well, not my generation, the generation before. So Charles Tilly replied. He replied in Social Research, in it's volume 70, issue number 2, in 2003. And he replied with a paper called Political Identities in Changing Polities, which is a kind of a summary of a bigger book, which is quite difficult to read because it's really, it's really historical sociology. And what he says is, well, what he says and what I add to what he says, it's a mixture of what he thinks and what I think, is, well, we should not throw the baby out of the bath with the bathwater, because it's not because we don't use the concept properly that the concept is not useful. What we try to achieve with the notion of identity is a very difficult task. We want at the same time to encapsulate, to approach the link between the individual and the collective, which is really at the core of identification process. We want to be able to look at something which is at the same time permanent, in-depth, and changing and flexible, which is usually what we get in identity stories. And we want to get a grasp at the same time what is subjective and objective, which is also what we've got in identity stories. And there is a need for that, because this is human complexity, because this is human society. So saying we will just forget about this because it's too complicated is not very ambitious. So, and he suggests a very, very simple and I think very convincing way of trying to approach identity, saying that identities are social arrangements, meaning they are, and it's very easy, they are just stories about who we are, who I am, who we are, and who are the others. It's just narrative stories, so he doesn't use narrative so much. It's stories in his, and I think he has a purpose. It's the way we tell ourselves who we are, and in contrast with the others, but more importantly for ourselves, who are we really? And he says, and it's very important, that these stories, which are the result of the competition of elites, of group, of mobilization. You know that Charles Tilly is interested in social mobilization and in history. And there is a permanent competition in all societies and across societies about these stories of defining people, defining groups, defining collective actors. And these stories are the way to define them. So we know with sociological history how to work out that, how to look at how people across time have invented these stories and have empowered collective actors, have created mobilization. For Tilly, this is really what matters in identity. And I think he says what is really important. So the quote, the second quote is more, it's longer than that. He says, whatever their truth or falsehood, by the standards of historical research, such stories play an indispensable role in the sealing of agreements and the coordination of social action. And I think this is what is really important in this discussion. Because, and it's another parenthesis, I think what struck me with this question of European identity is that it's as if we know that the way nations were forged and developed was thanks to national narratives. And we tend to force things and to invent narratives for Europe in order to just build some kind of European identity. But this is not the way it works. What matters is that these stories become powerful when they were really, let's say, at stake in the mobilization process. And it's a competition between groups and between actors, between institutions, between opponents, between, again, something coming from the bottom. We cannot just impose and put a narrative and say, well, okay, this is Europe now, and please do identify with this. The process will work only if there is this competition between different actors who wants to construct narrative. But if somebody wants to do that, and not only institution, and what matters in the story is that once this narrative exists and once people get identified to it, meaning once they believe they are part in the story, they believe that they are one character in the story, then it becomes efficient because And I think this is very important. It plays a role in the sealing of agreements and the coordination of social action. This is where it matters. And I think with identity there is something which is a bit, because of this reflexivity of social sciences and society and political actors, we tend to believe that we know it's all construction. But the fact that it is construction, it's very powerful. It's always very powerful. So we know that something has been constructed by men and women, by human beings. But then once human beings get convinced it's true, then it actually makes them work and makes them decide who they want to work with or not and what kind of actions they will have. So it's very important. And I think it's the same with Benedict Anderson, Imagine Community. It's a very powerful sentence. Everybody uses it. But being imagined doesn't mean it's less powerful. It's not because it's an imagination that you are not thoroughly convinced, is that you will not act as if you were this character. Although some critical sociologists will tell you, well, but what do you believe you are? A national character. You are a human being. But if you're convinced, then you will not be able easily unconvinced, or I don't know the word. Okay. And I think with Michael's Billig, banal nationalism. Banal nationalism looks as if it was something benign, something sweet, something ordinary, something of a daily life. But this is the opposite. What Billig wants to tell you is that banal nationalism is an ideology. It makes you work. It makes you act as you act, and it's something you don't know. It's something you've been taught very early on, and you don't know. It's just acting through you. Okay, so sorry about this moment of, but I think it's important. So we cannot construct narratives. This is what I wanted to say, and I think all the operation, all what it has worked in this European identity stuff, in European studies, is trying to find narratives and to get people to identify that. It doesn't work like that. It will work if some groups, some people really want to and agree and win and get to construct narrative and convince people to become character in the play. And this is where actually Charles Tilly doesn't know how to play the second part of the story. He knows how to analyze how people came to build narratives, how groups were in competition, how collective actors are generated and offer and build narratives. What he doesn't know very well to do, because it's not his work, is how to analyze the way people get to identify with stories. And the process is very important, is political socialization. It's not a psychological process. It's a sociological process. Political socialization is a long time process, and this is where time, Laura were telling you about yesterday, comes into play. So you've got the time to build the narrative, but you have the time at the human life level. Well, you get socialized politically in a very long-term way. First, you get a political socialization when you were born. I supervised, it was a wonderful experience, a doctoral dissertation about child and nation from, it was done in France, but it's in English. She's called Catherine Trossel, and she submitted her dissertation. She defended it last year. And what she shows is at 7 years or 8 years old children in France and the UK are already nationalists in the sense of Billig. They already know that the world is a world of nation. They already know why it is their nation, and what is really interesting is that they can tell you about, because then when you grow up, you tend to forget about what you've been told as a child, because it's just a bit childish. It's just a bit stupid. So it's better to forget it, because you would not be able to, fight for these ideas, but they are within you. But when you discuss with children, when they are 7 or 8, they can tell you all the false story, all the stories they've been told, and they already know. And it's already too late to make them believe they are human beings, that nations do not matter. So this process, it's a generational process. And when you ask the parents don't want to tell their children nationalist stories. They don't want to tell them about that. I mean, they do it because they've been told the same. And it's something that, you know, it's banal because it just happened, because people reproduce this thing. So it's a generational process, this political socialization. It doesn't mean that you cannot change. It doesn't mean that being an Erasmus, being a Europeanist, you will not, you know, get across differences, get to talk to people, open your mind, have different ideas. But these first ideas you've been told as a baby, it will be very difficult to really forget about them. So political socialization is a long-term issue, and wanting to find European identity as something similar as this generational story that was the socialization to nation. Now, when it's only a few generations, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. Oh, sorry. Okay, so that's my definition of European identification. I'm not doing social identity theory, so what I will tell you about how the qualitative turn showed that it's not a very good idea to search European identity. It refers to this definition and not to the definitions in and out definition. Okay. So about the qualitative turn in European studies. Okay, before was the Eurobarometer. And actually, Michael Bruter's session should have been first, because we had Eurobarometer from the beginning of European integration, so from the early 70s, and this is the qualitative turn came out a kind of saturation of re-analysis of Eurobarometer data. So the very first qualitative book, I'm sure you all know it, is Diez Medrano's famous Framing Europe, which came out in 2003, which is a typical mixed method approach. When I say mixed method approach, it's really qualitative, quantitative. It's not the question of the mixture between positivism and interpretativism or constructivism, whatever you want, some ism. Juan Diez Medrano wanted to write this book because he actually he wanted to go in greater depth into the black box of the influence of nationality on support to European integration. And it's a very cognitivist approach. He even wanted to see if in different countries, which are in this case Germany, Spain and the UK, if people were more or less federalist or not federalist. So it's very precise about the kind of understanding of European integration he wanted to search. And so he went through 6 cities, and he made a lot of interviews. What's also very interesting is that he also had a look at books, novels, at head of states speeches. So he had a very varied documentation, and he did discourse analysis in order to, so it's a frame approach. So he wanted to see what kind of framing of European integration took place in the 3 countries. And he shows that there are really different frames. And so the idea then, one of the conclusions is, then it's no wonder that people, when they answer Eurobarometer questions, they don't answer the same thing in different countries because they don't understand the same thing with the question. European integration has another meaning in the different countries, so they give different answers, and it's just a mechanical process. It's not because there is some kind of magie, of wonder with national. It's a political culture book. I gave you in the readings. I gave you it was I don't know if you were supposed to. It was complimentary or not. A sequel to his books that he wrote in 2010. So it means 7 years later. And which is a kind of revisiting the book. First, he was very amazed at the time to see that people would interpret his book as being a book on European identity. The confusion comes from the fact that at that time, during the second part of the 80s, so it was after the Maastricht Treaty, so where although the referendum went well, they didn't go so well. Especially in France, we were expected a huge a very, very large victory of the yes, and it was just short, and it was the same almost everywhere. So in European studies, it became to be a bit of a threat about what is happening with. So it's the beginning of the idea that consensus, dissensus. The Lindbergh and Scheil-Gold stuff. You know, yes, was coming at the end. So it's the beginning. And then this is the idea, well, but it's because we are not able to search really in depth into affections of the citizen, because we are just using Eurobarometer, and with survey questions it's difficult to go into affect. So we tend not to see what is certainly going on, meaning that people might, now that they understand that the union is becoming a real political entity, and they have been given European citizenship, so now certainly they care, but they care, and it means we have to be able to analyze the affects they have towards the European Union. So then began the qualitative work, and Diaz Medrano was interpreted as someone who would use qualitative tool in order to search for this kind of feelings, which he was not doing at all. Again, he was more in doing frame analysis, meaning he had a cognitive approach. But, you know, when people, you know how it is with books, people usually don't read it from the beginning to the end. It's just very quick. So it was a misunderstanding. And what is interesting in the sequel in 2010, what he does is that he actually disclosed the fact that he did ask a few questions about identity at the time, but he didn't use it in the book because it was just, he could not get any conclusion just because people would not understand the questions. And Diaz Medrano was absolutely not somebody who wanted to do a fight between quantitative and qualitative work. So he kept it for himself because he was of no interest for the book. And it was of no interest for the book because he was not dealing with identity. But what happened is that when he tried, at the end of the interviews, meaning that people would have tell him for 1 hour, 1 hour and a half about Europe, European integration, etc. And he would ask them, but and you, how you feel European? They would be surprised. But what's the question? What do you mean? And me, European, what does that mean? And again, not just as a Eurobarometer question that happens to you on the phone when you are cooking for dinner and you don't know how to. No, people who would have been discussing European issues for 1 hour and a half. So meaning they should have been aware of, you know, they were discussing that. So Diaz Medrano, there is a kind of confusion. At the time, it's really not a turn. It's, on the contrary, exactly what we understand as mixed method approach. We try to use the one and the other in the same kind of approach. In this case being quite exploratory, because he uses the qualitative tool behind Eurobarometers in order to more or less check that what he found in his interviews, is supported, so the national difference are also, you could look at them in the data, in the quantitative data, if you knew how to look at it, okay? So, what I think is really the turning point, which is the pioneering work, is Ulrike Meinhof, the paper I gave you to read, and I hope you read it because I would have liked to write it. I think it's a wonderful piece of work, but it's a bit of a wonder to me because it was published in edited volumes that you certainly know. I think you all quote it, which was from Risser, Brewer, and with the third one, and which is transnational identity, where you have really the state of the art of the discussion about European identity as a mainstream analysis. So using social identity theory, Marilyn Brewer is a social psychologist, with Emmanuel Castano, who is one of her students, and is doing, you know, the perfect analysis of how you should adapt social identity theory to the analysis of European identity. Plus, you've got the Citrin and Sidus paper, which is a very good quantitative mainstream piece. And you've got the Risser marble cake, and you've got Brutter and the civic and cultural. You've got everything. It's all the major papers of the mainstream European identity research. But, and I still don't understand why, they published Ulrike Meinhof, who she doesn't belong to the same circles at all. She's an anthropologist, and she's doing very qualitative work. And I don't know if you read the paper, but I reread it this morning. And it's really interesting because all the first part of the paper, she tried to say, well, what I do is very similar to what they do. It's really, there are lots of we agree. But at the end, she just says exactly the opposite. And she says the opposite. She says, if you use an indirect approach, if instead of asking people with stimuli where are you European or not, are you more European than national, if you don't do that, if you just go and try to understand their experience of their life and how they relate to the political communities they've been into, well, Europe doesn't exist. It's not in the picture. And where it's very interesting is that she chose to study people at the border of the German and Polish border, so on the two sides of the border, in a place where, so you could have a lot of stories about national identities and etc., but also where European Union is very active, meaning it's everywhere. You can see signs at the border indicating that the European Union is funding bridges, is funding reconstruction. It's everywhere. And she even uses pictures in order to, when people don't mention European Union, she would use a picture to say, but what is on the picture? Can you see the signs? And they just don't see it. Which I think is really interesting because after that you will get, and Laura's work, and I know Philip, you're in this project, on symbols. And with the idea that when people see symbols, they will change. But in this case, these people would cross the bridge every day, see the symbols all the time, and still, you really have to ask, but you know you're European, right? You know, because it's on it's there, it's on the sign. And then they will say, well, maybe, yes, probably, but what matters is that I am German, or I am, So I think it was really a very important work. And so she published extensively with other people on this. But this particular piece, I think it's really interesting that it is in this specific volume. I would not have known about it if it was not there. I think it's the beginning of something that is changing in European studies. Michael Brutter's Citizen of Europe, you also all know about it. It's actually a collection of all the different chapters he published in many different journals. Brutter's is doing, I think, something which wants to be very similar to Diez Medrano. So he wants to go in greater depth into the way people actually understand European integration. And he has this differentiation between the civic and the ethnic, the civic and the cultural, I think, dimension in this case. So he does not only Eurobarometer analysis, he tries, and I think it's very rare, to also do quantitative experimental data collection. And he does, or he had made a series of focus groups. And his conclusion is that something is arriving, something is coming, European identity is coming. My problem with his book is that the qualitative part, which is at the end, it's just a chapter, the series of focus group was made basically with students. And this is my other problem with social psychology and psychology in general, is that psychological laws or psychological processes are supposed to be universal. They are supposed to be, not different from different social milieux, from different positioning. And Michael Brutter does the same. He does experimentation, meaning that it's the same to ask students or to ask workers or to ask taxi drivers or to ask families at the border. It doesn't matter, which is not true. European identity is, again, it's about power. It's about power relationships. So your position in the social structure matters tremendously if we want to understand what you think about European integration. So it didn't find in Citizens of Europe any problem between its quantitative analysis and its focus groups. But its focus groups are with students. And they are really marketing research, meaning not the kind of exploratory collective interviews I told you yesterday about. It's more putting people in a room, 12, 14 people, and you have an hour to tell everything you know about European, integration, how you feel about Europe. So it's very different. From the second half of the year, of the first decade of 2000 something. I can't do that. There is an accumulation of sign. So I could go, but I will not do that. But if you're interested, I can give you references. This accumulation of research projects funded by the EU had sometimes paradoxical results. What happened is that they are usually research projects funded for 3 years with a couple of millions, because this is really what it does take, a couple of millions, gathering team coming from 6 to 8 to 10 countries of the community or outside, or, you know, countries who want to enter the EU. So people who don't know each other, they have 3 years to do the job. So usually what happens, at the end of the project, it's not finished. It has only begun. So you have to give reports. You have to show that you've published, so people do so. And it's very bad. But really, it's bad. It's bad quality. It's not ripe. It's just description of things that people didn't interpret and understand correctly. But a couple of years later, if some of the people in the group have continued to work on the data, then you get some publications that are interested. And I think in particular to Lynn Jamieson, who is a scholar in Scotland, and she was responsible for a project like that. And when you read the end report, it's very plain, so you don't know really what the conclusions are. But later work, she goes into this idea that they actually experience difficulties in trying to find out about identity. They found some people who were strongly identified, but most of the others interviewees, and they were young people, were actually not interested at all by the discussion and by the interviews. So this is one example. There are others where it's later work where you can find that actually funded by the Commission, we try hard to find European identity, because when you want to get money in this project, at the beginning you have to say what your results will be. But I'm not joking. This is what happened. In the project, you give your deliverables, and in the deliverable, it's more or less already your results. And if you don't do or don't find what you said you would do and would find, you have to justify it. And you might have to give the money back. But really, this is what is actually at stake in this project. So it's a real problem for social scientists. It means so we have to play by the rules, and it's only later that we can revisit the data and try to make sense of it. So it's a very long process. However, Fabel's book has nothing to do with the European funded project. It's a project on his own. Fabel is coming from a very different perspective. He was doing more political theory. His book, his dissertation was about theories of integration, a comparison of discourse about immigration and integration in France and the UK. I don't know exactly why he went into this book. I know Adrian, but I've never really properly understood. Adrian is a real cosmopolite. So he was born in the UK, he did his PhD in the UK, then he went to France, and he left for Los Angeles, then he went to Denmark, now he's again in France, and his art is in Japan. He's a very good collector and commentator of Japanese work. So he's really a character, he's really impressive guy. And why on earth did he decide to do this book on Eurostar, Eurocity? So it's an exploration, it's an analysis. He calls it anthropological, but I think it's more sociological. He's called a sociologist. Where in 3 cities, so in Amsterdam, London, and Brussels, he went on to try to discuss and understand the motivations of young Europeans who decided to go and live and work in another European country, and that is city. So his selection of case is the 3 cities, and in each city he would meet as many other Europeans, so non-national, as possible. And he tries to understand why they decided to go abroad, so they decided to leave their country, why they decided to settle in this new country, and what happened, and how they experience this integration process, and if they're happy with that. And the story is a sad story. which is really interesting. And it's really a sad story. If you read the end of Adrian Favel's book, it finishes in a cemetery. In a cemetery, you understand the word? Where he was actually looking for the end of the nation state, and he didn't find it. And on the contrary, what he found is that these people who went abroad because they wanted to escape the borders of their own nation state, which was actually more or less enclosing their own future, they cannot settle and they want to go back. And to Adrian, it's a sad story, because he was very much in favor of European integration. As I said, he's a cosmopolitan, which is actually interesting because he left for the US. So he's European, but he's more somebody who belongs to the world. And he was interested in this capacity of people to escape their nation. And again, what he finds is the opposite, is that what these people tell him is that it's too difficult. They cannot find their ways. They don't feel at home. They cannot find a new home. And they want to go back. And they are still interested in the politics of their own nation. They are not interested in what happened where they are. So to him, it's a sad story. And what I found interesting is that in the book, he doesn't mention politics. Or hardly, but actually it's not there. So again, the paper I gave you is a sequel. It's something he wrote in 2010 because I asked him about the politics, which I think it's not by chance that he omitted it, because again, it doesn't match the story he wanted to find. What he wanted to find at the beginning, the idea is that these people were the true European. They were the people who were actually using what Europe is offering and who would become the true European and would build the new Europe. But it also means they were the European citizens. So European citizen means, in a way, being involved in European affairs, in European politics, getting an interest. And you know that all this story about the democratic deficit of the European Union is originally about people don't vote at European election. And what is interesting is that his Eurostars don't vote either. While you would expect them to vote. I mean, if they can do that, if they can go change their country, go and work abroad, it's because of European Union. So maybe they could find it difficult to get used to new politics, so the politics of the new country where they arrive, but at least they should be interested in European politics, and they are not at all. So it's also a complicated story. And Adrian Favel but it's not directly linked to that, but also wrote a very nice paper, Europe Identity's Problem. He is actually very against this notion of identity because he didn't find it. He didn't find it with people who were supposed to be the one who should be identified with Europe. So his idea, and this is the end of the paper, well, not the long interview with the guy, but the end of the proper paper, is that democracy is changing. Electoral democracy is at the end it's the end of an era, and the kind of power relationship and the kinds of way citizens can impact on polities is not anymore with elections, but is as consumers, as networking people, as people who would change the ways around themselves locally, but not doing electoral democracy. I think we can discuss that because it's highly problematic. Anyway, it's not at the moment what we are really offered by European integration. So Favel and more or less in the second half from between 2005 2010, you can see small bits in different papers, in different books, people who do not really address this question of European identity, but are doing qualitative work. And it seems that they cannot confirm what you find in quantitative work. Because what you find in quantitative work at the time is also discussion about increasing Euroscepticism, about the increasing politicization of EU affairs, and of the growing polarization of European public. This is the end again of the consensus. So it's what you find in quantitative data, and it's what you see in qualitative work is more and more difficulty to relate to these results. And the two books that will really make a difference are Gaxey's book, Gaxey's and his team book, and Jonathan White's. Gaxey, I will go quite, I will be quite quick. Actually, the French edition is in 2010, and the Perception of Europe is the English edition, ECPR Press, and it was published in 2001. At the same time, I Jonathan White. I will be quick because I don't like the book because it's absolutely unsystematic. So it's a Bourdieusian framework. It addresses the question of the perception on European identity of European integration with a very clear idea that it's European integration is a domination process. It's a kind of accentuation of the normal standard dominations that you get through democratic governance. And so this idea is that citizens cannot relate to European affairs or European issues because you need to have a kind of political sophistication which is very linked to a specialization process and reserved only for an elite. So it's a kind of, you really see that they already know from the beginning of the work what they wanted to show, and it's very unsystematic. You cannot even know how many interviews they conducted. You know which countries, but you don't even have a list. You don't know which interviews. You don't know how they analyze it. It's a mess. The book is a mess. But I think it goes in the same direction of the rest, and especially why Jonathan White's book is a great book. I mean, if you want to do me a favor, if you found what I said interesting, have a look at his book because it's really a great book. So it's called Political Allegiances. It took me years to be able to pronounce that, allegiances after European integration. So again, it was his PhD. It comes from political theory. Jonathan White is very interested in political theory, and his other work are on the role of political parties in democracy. So what he did, his idea was, we should stop trying to find a European demos and trying to believe that the future of democracy at the European level is linked to the communality and the fact that people will identify together with the same political entity. What matters to him is there is democracy if people believe that their political system can make a difference regarding their issues and their problems. So there will be a European democracy if people believe that the European Union will be able to make a difference, will be able to solve part of their problem, not all of them, but part of their problem. If they believe, first, that there is agency in the world, and this is very important to him, and this is really more or less the opposite of this idea of we identify with something which will be more or less God and will give us everything. It's the idea that we feel that problems might be addressed and that somebody can make a difference, and who can make a difference? Is that us? Is that people around? Is that other institutions? Is that governments? Is that your European Union? And his idea was, and more than that, we also will have a kind of European citizenship. Is not only people believe that their union can be a kind of government and solve problems, but also if they believe that their problems are not caused by other Europeans. So this is the idea that it's not, Germans are not my problem. If we have problem, we have the same problem, the Germans and we. So it was what he was looking for. And then his idea, so it can be really debatable, and I know lots of people disagree with that because he chose to interview taxi drivers. And the problem is the sampling, because his taxi drivers are all white male, which, I mean, when you look at taxi drivers in cities, they are not always, well, male maybe, and it's not so clear, but all white, so it's a bit, that's a problem, because he decided he would go only for volunteers, so it's really brave, because it means he went in cities and he would talk to taxi drivers and try to find taxi drivers who would agree to find a couple of friends, all taxi drivers, and discuss with him in a cafe, in some places. He would pay them for the time they would spend with him, because it's the same as if they have continue working. But well, so it's not, I don't know if you sometimes try to have interviews with people just going on the street and try to, well, please, would you give me 1 hour, 2 hours because I want to discuss social issues with you? It's really difficult to do. So he's a brave guy. And so he has these collective interviews with taxi driver, and his idea was he would ask them to identify a series of problems and decide what were the most important problems they would face. So he would give them cards identifying a whole series of problems and try to ask them to organize them in, let's say, meta area of problems. And then he would ask them to discuss this problem and try to say if there are solutions to their problem, who is responsible for them, who can do something. So you've got the text I gave you. Sorry, to read is a quite good summary of the book. I think the book is worth reading it from the beginning to the end, but at least have a look at the paper. And the paper is very clear. What happened is that people will not mention the EU or hardly. So what it would do is if they didn't discuss at all European Union as being a level of governance, as being responsible, as having any kind of agency, it would ask them at the end. But basically, in the different series of problems, so what happened? No, there is only one positive result. In his theoretical approach, he also had the idea that there would be a kind of European citizenship if people would face the same kind, analyze that they have the same kind of problems. If the French, the Germans, the British, the Czech, because it was in the Czech Republic, have very different problems, then it will be difficult to imagine that we'll have a system of governance addressing the same, main issues. And the only positive result is that actually in the Czech Republic, in the UK and in Germany, you more or less get the same results. Major problem as the economy, relation between what he calls relation between the people, so all kind of racism and civility and violence and law and order. I don't know, this last one. So three, and it's more or less, so again, they were asked to categorize different kinds of problems, and it's more or less the same categorization that they build. So he finds that at least some degree of integration, which I think it's true. But after that, what happened is that you have a very low degree of agency, and when there is agency, it's never the European Union. And he finds in most of the interviews also that actually other nationalities are part of the problem, which we didn't find. So again, very disappointing results. What is interesting is that Duchesne and his team are very against European integration. They belong to the French left, and the French left, well, the French, yes, let's say, at least the part which is considered Eurosceptics. So they do not regret what they find. While Jonathan White is a true European. So it's in a way like Adrian Favel, he's very disappointed. And so it's interesting to see how sometimes really scholars can really show that they found results that are not their expectation. And it's very clear in the book. So the end of the book is not very good because he tries to find ways to find new argumentation to convince Europeans that they are false to not believe in the European Union and European integration. So it's not very convincing. But it's nice because it shows that, well, he really struggled with what he found, but he's, honest, and what he found is a disappointment. Okay, it's already 1 hour. I'll be quick here because I already said it yesterday. So basically, we have a kind of a puzzle. Because what quantitative work tells us is that we are experiencing a growing polarization of European public, that people are more and more either identified with the European Union or becoming Eurosceptic, and that we are going to a Euroclash, as Flickstein said, and more importantly, the problem is that elites are supposed to be more and more identified with European integration, while on the contrary, working class or masses are more and more Eurosceptics. And what we find in qualitative work is that people don't care. or that it's very, very difficult to get people to tell us about what they feel about the European Union when we don't ask them directly. And when people like Meinhof or Jonathan White try to get any access to the notion of saliency of European issues, European something, so the idea is, does it matter for people? Yes, they can answer questions. You can always have people answering any kind of questions. But does that matter to them? And when we try with qualitative tools to find if it matters, it doesn't. How do we solve the problem? At the same time, the same people would all say what is the best ever is mixed method. Okay, but how you do mixed method when the two methods give opposite results? It's exactly the book where you've got Meinhof, the only qualitative paper, saying exactly the opposite than all the rest of the book. So, okay, so in your dissertation, please do mixed method. But if you do that, I mean, you will just, either you do what Brutus did, and you take students, and you experiment on students, and then that will be okay. You will have the same result with quantitative material and with students, with qualitative exploration. But if you try to look for, let's say, ordinary people out of the classroom, people in the street, then you will get into trouble. So how we solve the puzzle? So first, in the book, yesterday it was just one chapter, but what we show with our experimentation, which is a kind of experimentation, is that actually Hugi and Marx are not wrong when they say there is a constraining dissensus, but the polarization that quantitative surveys show is a polarization among politicized people, among elites. There is a polarization among politicized people, among educated people, meaning that we don't have a consensus anymore within elites that European integration is a good thing. And that is the end of the permissive consensus. The end of the permissive consensus is when part of the European elites have decided against European integration, while at the beginning everybody was in favor of. But it's not a Euro clash, not in the Flickstein sense, because the mass of the population don't care. What matters doesn't happen with European integration. What matters happens with globalization, with the transformation of the global order, with the economy, with the financial crisis. Even if we were in 2006, crisis was already there. And this is what happened to them. And this is what happened to Jonathan White's taxi drivers. This is the economy. This is a question of border opening. This is not European integration. Border opening is not related to European integration. It might seem odd to people who have actually learned European integration at the university, but it's not the way people understand it. So that's the first part of solving the puzzle. The second is what Virginie von Ingelgom, I told you briefly yesterday, did, and she was part of our team, but she did her PhD on reanalyzing part of all the Eurobarometers, and she shows that because scholars, Europeanists, were obsessed by the question of European identity and Euroscepticism, they actually took out all indifferent people in the analysis. And if you look since the mid-90s, what is happening, you can, if you take out people who don't answer the question or say we are neither know, we don't know, all these people, if you take them out, you can show that there is more and more a growing Euroscepticism because it's less a positive balance between people who say yes and people who say no. But if you reintroduce indifferent people in the discussion, and if you really do a proper analysis of with a good statistical tool, I could not tell you about, but it's in her work. I know she's good. And you do a real polarization analysis, you see that there is no polarization actually. What is happening is not something like that, but it's something like that. It's becoming more and more wider. So we can solve the puzzle, but in this case, this is to say that quantitative work was actually mistaken. It was a mistake. It's because they were looking for something and they could find it in the data. But with another theory, inductive, constructed in an inductive way with qualitative work, we can tell you that we actually see a very different process. Not a generalized polarization of public opinion in Europe. What we see is a growing discrepancy between two kinds of relationship to European integration. The elite one, more and more convinced that something is happening at the European level, wanting either to change Europe or to continue with it, with a growing antagonism between the two. And on the other side, the mass of the population who trust less and less their elites, who get very contradictory interpretation from their elites, and so become more and more ambivalent and more indifferent to the process. This is what we can see in quantitative data. Okay. Okay, so my okay. Okay, so my being to be tired. Okay, so what are the conclusions for that? I think, so going back to the question of positivist and inductive approach, you can use a positivist approach, meaning using quantitative work in particular, but also qualitative work, for testing theories when you already know the theory. When you don't know the theory, you cannot do that. And importing from other fields is usually not a very good, I know it might sound against interdisciplinary approach, and you said it's a three, it's a 3I, so we are supposed to be international, interdisciplinary, and innovative. I'm a bit more skeptical about interdisciplinary work, unless you really build a team with people who are good in their discipline and work together. If you just pop into libraries and borrow books from other disciplines and follow others who told you where you should use that, it's usually not a very good idea. Because you don't know about the controversies in the field where you've just, borrow your theory and you apply it, and usually it doesn't match what you're actually looking at. In this case, we don't know what is happening. What we know is European integration is a matter of, sorry, we are trying to build or to transform our government system, the way we govern ourselves. It's a question of power. So we should use concepts and adapt concepts and try to transform theories coming from the political field and sociology. Sociology is also about power structure, but not from fields where the question of power doesn't matter, where you believe in universal phenomenon. What happens it's socially contextualized. It's very different. It depends where we are. So I really think at the moment we cannot be positivists just because we don't know what we are looking at and we don't have a theory that works. But it doesn't mean that we don't have to do it afterwards. I'm not saying I only believe in interpretation. I think this back and forth between interpretation and theory testing, it's a matter of time. You cannot do both at the same time. That was why mixed method is not a mixing of positivism and constructivism. It's not. You cannot do that. I agree with people who say it doesn't make sense. I mean, it's your brain being twisted if you do both at the same time. But what is interesting is going from one to the other and then back to, and I think this is the way science get better. I think we should always produce some kind of knowledge, knowing it's only a step in knowledge. So I offer something, a new analysis, and somebody else would come and rephrase it and transform it. And this back and forth between positivism and constructivism or interpretation, this is how it works. But at this moment in European studies, we are really in need for new interpretation and new theory building. We cannot, I mean, reading all your papers, we cannot again and again use the same theories that were used and say, well, I will test it because I will be more clever using a bit differently this variable. It doesn't work. I mean, I think it doesn't work. So we have to accept that the notion itself, I think European identity or identification might be wrong. And we really need to go for indirect questioning. This is what White did. This is what we try to do with our groups. Try to give people the possibility to tell us about how they really feel about this question. And if we give them words, when you want people to tell you about something which is complicated, don't give them words, or they will use it. And you will not know what they really think about it. But it means time. It means you ask from people something which is difficult for them, because they don't have the answer. So they have to accept to even ask themselves in front of you, and this is a complicated task. It means trust. It means they have to trust you. They have to believe that you will do something interesting with that, because it's an effort. That's also why I was saying yesterday night that you have to pay, you have to give something to people who would accept to do that. Do not focus on the EU. I said at the beginning, I really think we don't know what is happening. Will we really go up to the world? We will construct a global order? Are we really designing something new with Europe, or are we just going back to more nationalism? We don't know. So just focusing at the European level, you don't know what you're looking at. Yesterday, Laura said it's a question of conceptual net. She told you about conceptual nets, and she said we have to find the good grains, the good whites of the net. The problem is that with this European identity, which I think is a wrong concept, we tend to adapt the net to something that doesn't exist, and the rest just goes through the net and we don't catch anything. So I think we really should say, okay, as we don't know what we are looking at, let's try for the beginning to have a wide angle. And then to spot what is interesting, what is moving, what is transforming. Globally speaking, what interests us in this question of European identity, if this is not to legitimize the European integration, it is to understand how people just react to transformation. And European integration is not the only thing that is moving in their view. All is changing. So wide angle and look at European integration as being only one of the moves in the picture. Be very careful, I think that's the most important thing. Be very careful to avoid focusing on elites and politicized people. What is really, really difficult when you are a young scholar who has been trained in universities, in good universities, being really good, is people are not all the same. And it might, I know some people believe it's elitist, but it's not elitist to say lots of people don't care about politics. They don't care about the EU. They don't care about lots of things because they care about what matters to them. And it is not European integration. So if you want to understand how people react to it, you have to see real people. And they are very unlikely to be in your circles. I know it's difficult to accept, but it's usually true. So it's very important. And so don't ask students. Never. And then be reflexive and control all the research process. And I'm sorry, but it means to be cautious about Eurobarometer. We know Eurobarometer are a political tool in the hands of the Commission. And most Europeans just play with the tool. And they know it. So we all have a footnote at the beginning of the chapter saying, well, it's a pity we have only a Eurobarometer. We know it's not good. But, well, we have it, so we use it. I think it's time to stop that.
I have a question about, I guess, appropriate methods here, because you've made the case very strongly, I think, in favor of qualitative methods and even moving against or away from mixed methods. But I wonder if the problem isn't Eurobarometer rather than survey research in general. And do you see, some scope for survey research that's more nuanced, asking more indirect sorts of questions of participants? Do you see that as something useful, or do you think that survey research has just really sort of been part of the problem and it doesn't have anything viable to add at this point?
No, clearly the main problem is with Eurobarometers. First because, well, I've been, I think, twice invited by Eurobarometer people, because it's very a legitimation process. So it means they also invite social scientists as well as people to discuss the tool and to improve it. But the room for improvement is very, very small, because we're supposed to keep the questions because we want to have long-term series. So it's really a problem with the Eurobarometer. So the problem is that survey research, when it's comparative, is expensive. So I think we should use other data sets. So the ESS and ESSP, so there are other comparative data sets which are already much better. But the problem is that if you use them, they very often have less questions focused on European Union, which makes sense because they are interested in Europe, in generally speaking. But I think it's already better. Or what it would be interested is to be on new tools using the results of qualitative work to ask better questions. The problem is the money. And especially for young researchers, you usually use data sets that are already there. You can collect your own data when it's qualitative, but quantitative survey is difficult. And if you go, so you could have it could be less expensive using now the internet and the new way of interrogating people. The problem is that we know that it's a huge distortion you have a problem of representativity. But we have to, it's improving because the internet will become, will go through more or less on the social milieu. So it might become better. So until last week, I tended to believe that it was really a question of tool because I don't know if you know Ragging's work on what is the case, and I've always been very convinced by the way he compares the logic of quantitative research and the logic of qualitative. But I think he is mistaken. That you can use quantitative data in an exploratory way and trying to avoid, and this is people who do correspondence analysis, for instance, they don't do variable-oriented research. And you can go into structural research using quantitative work and being so... I think I was more or less mistaken. I think what matters is more to be inductive and to try to... I think the main thing is that you don't believe you already know about the borders and the dimensions of the phenomenon, of the process of reaction to European integration. So yes, we should try to have better data. And as I said, I think this is a responsibility of my generation of scholars. We should have, instead of just complaining that Eurobarometer is not good, we should have just insisted on saying we need to build something else. We need to find the money for that. And we could have, but we didn't do it.
Sorry, yeah. And I am actually trying to do the same for you now. I am a social psychologist, and from your presentation, I feel like I should not be included in European identity research because I'm using the wrong approach and I'm using the wrong theories. For example, with social identity theory, and this is my second. So this is the first question. What do you think about me being here? Is this right? Is it wrong? Should I leave the room? Also, with regards to Thursday, where you were commenting my paper. So, yeah, this is interesting. But the second thought I had was that I do not really agree with your thoughts on social identity theory, because you say it's not about power, and I believe that actually social identity theory is about nothing else but power, because we become members of a group to have a positive self-concept, and if the group isn't powerful or doesn't, provide what we need, we leave the group. So it is kind of about how powerful is the group compared to other groups as well, if you go in this direction of reading the theory. Of course, I know there are some difficulties with it, but I would not agree that it has nothing to do with power at all. So those two things maybe to start with.
Okay, so first you should certainly not leave the room. I said it's a provocation. I know you will not change your research project dissertation, and it's not the aim of it. As I said, know that other things exist. And once you've got your position, maybe you could say, okay, maybe now I'm free to do exactly what I want, and I could maybe read different things, and it's more really this avenue of, and I promise I will be very nice on Thursday. I read your paper already, so I know I can be. About social identity theory, it is about the power relationship between social groups. But my point is it's not the same thing of discussing with a power relationship between groups within a polity and discussing what it is to belong to a polity. A polity means that altogether we have the power to govern ourselves, which is very different from saying, do I feel better or worse than the other, than the guy next to me. It means, and remember I said Tilly says something about what matters in this question of identity is how it, influences the ceiling of actions. The fact that we can, or we will, or we will not act together, mobilize together, do things together. And I think this is what is at the heart of the question of a polity, of a political system, of citizenship. We're discussing citizenship. With this identity matter, we are actually discussing citizenship. Will we have the kind of involvement in this story, which is European integration, in such a way that we will actually act, mobilize, do something, want to change it? And I think it's not in social identity theory, where it is a comparison. But again, I said the problem with importation of concepts is that you usually, when you import it, is different. It's not so good. Not that you could not import things and that it becomes different and it might be better. But in this case, I think the way it's used in European studies, it's so repetitive. I mean, always be cautious. When you see that something is said and quoted by everyone and always in the same way, and no taste, no flavor, nothing, it has become wrong. So I think social identity theory has become a wrong concept because it's used in a mechanical way. You could challenge a concept and you could say, okay, well, obviously the question of the other is important, and in the Ulrike Meinhof paper, she's very much about this, about othering and how you create that. I don't say it's not important, but if really we're interested in European identity, it's because we want to promote European citizenship and a kind of European citizenship that would be an active one. And this is not in social identity theory, I think. So I think we should. And I mean, we have tools. I mean, we have in nationalism studies, again, Tilly's work, and there are lots of things very interesting in sociology. Why should we leave sociology and political science and go into psychology to find a good concept? I don't understand. I think there is a problem. But please stay in the room, or I leave. He disagrees with me.
Yeah, I disagree because I heard very different questions in your presentation. So there are questions like, is there a European identity? Does the concept of European identity mean anything? And does the Eurobarometer useful? Does the qualitative data show different results than the Eurobarometer? I think that what you find from the qualitative turn is not really different from what many papers using the Eurobarometer show. I mean, I don't think that people using the Eurobarometer ever say that there is a big European identity or something like that. I mean, there are most papers at the beginning, like the most maybe quoted paper is maybe one from Matthew Gerber. It's much more about utilitarianism. And so it's quite what you say. People will support the EU if they benefit from it. And that's also what say Anderson in the same kind of idea. And he also said that people don't know if Europe benefits to them, so they rely on political leader. And it was also a way to say it's not really the European level which is interesting to understand if people support the European integration, but the national level, and so how the debate is framed in the political space of the national level. And there are many papers like that, like I think one of De Flem and Pempel, which is the myth of post-national identity, to show quite the same idea that even people who say that they are European, in a way they are national. So, I mean, you know, because you say tool doesn't matter, but you present really, you're very critical of Eurobarometer, so there is kind of mixed messages here, and it's also that, you know, you do like there is one use of the Eurobarometer, but I agree that many questions are very bad, that we are talking that before that the social variables are very bad, and so on, but there are 100 questions, so what does it really mean to say Eurobarometer is bad when you have so many questions, when they always change, because they change it very often, so it's not we only like, it would be very easy to have just one judgment on the Eurobarometer. The other thing is your point on European identity, which I think is very different, because in a way we say we don't need the concept, but in a way you use it because you say there is no European identity, which in a way is having a definition of European identity, and it's in a way using it to show that there is not a fact. So, I mean, in a way, it's in your approach, it's not useless because you need it to show, and you have a definition of European identity, which would be that people would be very interested in Europe. But it's not so sure that it's, and that it is what is really important in politics. Why do you want that people, I take little time because I think to the critics of Favre, especially in his last book, there is this kind of assumption that to be a European, you have to be very interested by Europe. But it's not so sure, you know. I mean, it's your concept of identity that in a democracy, people have to be very interested in the state. They have to share a common culture or something like that. But all the history of nationalism shows that it's not the case, that it's an illusion. It was really Gellner's point that it's an illusion of nationalists to think that to a state correspond a very unified nation. And in a way, Fervold criticized study of European integration, starting from the same assumption that to be a European, you have to be very interested in Europe, and it seems that the only Europeans are the ones who live in London, who speak 3 or 4 languages. But, well, whatever. I mean, in India there are also many different languages, and they use English for sometimes talking to each other, I think. So, why? I mean, so I think that you should have to, you know, precise. What do you critique when you say that the European identity is not a good concept? Is it that a certain identity doesn't exist? Or is that the question of identity do not matter at all? And if I agree that sometimes we give too much importance to identity, I think that when we look at the political situation, the conflict, between France, Germany, Greece, how are framed the idea of do the Greek are responsible or not for what happened to them. So all this very big conflict, I don't think that we really can think that identity doesn't matter at all for understanding what is going on in Europe. Okay, thanks.
Okay, so you're right. It's a mixed message presentation. I think what happens is that I got involved because I got involved quite early on in this question of European identity. I perfectly agree that there is in more general Eurobarometer analysis on more question of attitudes toward European integration. I think they are very good works. My problem was when I saw, and it's because we had this paper with Fournier with Is There European Identity, and that got quoted, and then I really was involved in a kind of business at some point, and I realized, and then I was doing qualitative work, so the two were there was a mixture of the two. So first I saw people doing again and again, more and more, this question of the relationship between national and European identification. And then with the idea of qualitative work being there to go in greater depth into the question of affects and emotions. And so I saw the beginning of a kind of business around European identity, which is actually a kind of a bit separated from the rest. And if you look at the papers and the quotations, Gabon, for instance, is not very often quoted in paper doing European identity work with Eurobarometer. And Anderson, it's a great paper. And he was right. I mean, he was absolutely right. And this is my point. I think he said very clearly, we don't need European identity as long as people trust their elites and trust their governments and agree to follow them in this new venture that is European integration. But what we got along the way is that trust in governments has really decreased. And we have a problem of inside national states, we have a problem of trust. And this is and I think this operation with European identity is because we have this problem of trust and we have the problem of polarization of elites that we, the Commission, Europeanists, promoters of European integration, want to find a European identity. This is, I think, one of the message. Then Eurobarometer, I think, is not good for that. But you could do other things with the data. But I still believe, and sorry, it's not my business. But from what I know from people doing, involved, for instance, in the European Social Science Survey or in other data sets, I still believe Eurobarometers is not the best. When you look at how it is implemented on the field in national countries, I don't think it's the best. And I'm sure it's not the best for a lot of questions regarding, again, political questions. So it doesn't mean you cannot do things with that. You can always use a not very good tool and be very clever and innovative and have new ideas. It's not, you use Eurobarometer, you're bad. Obviously it's different. But it's more complicated to do interesting things with a bad tool. It's more complicated than doing interesting things with a good tool. It's more my message. So I absolutely agree, two different messages. One is there was a kind of political operation, a political strategy about European identity, and I still believe it is, and this Young Scholar School is in a way part of it. And I know it's a provocation because I was invited to play the game, and in a way, I tell you, I'm a bit skeptical about the game we are playing, and I think it's my responsibility to say it. This is part of the message. The other is, again, I think with European integration, we need to use exploratory and interpretative ways of theory building. You could do it with Eurobarometer, but I think it's more complicated than with other data sets. And as Christine asked, I think we should try to have better tools.
Is there a result which is different? Because with a Eurobarometer, you can show that there's no European identity.
Well, you could, but a lot of people do the opposite. Well, have a look at the papers of your colleagues in the room. I think.
But most of the results of Eurobarometer for 30 years shows that very few people say that they feel European more than their country. So
yes, but we know that the question is stupid. The question is stupid. It doesn't mean anything. People don't wake up in the morning comparing Europe with the nation. I mean, that I'm sure from qualitative work. If you try to discover a little bit what it means for people to feel related to a political level, you don't compare. It's just meaningless. And we all know that when you want to use this variable, you have to oppose people who say national only with all the other answers, because this is what is meaningful. Yeah. So, yes, you can do that, but why ask? Why? I mean, it's a way of not respecting citizens to ask them stupid questions again and again and again, and with European money. It's our money. I mean, and we could work out with very intelligent questions about how people feel. You know, so I think we should say that. And it's very well documented that it's meaningless. But it doesn't mean, again, that you cannot do a very interesting work with it. But But I think, well, okay, you can have a very structuralist way of analyzing data set and saying, I don't care about what people answer, it doesn't matter if I find a structure, I will interpret it. You can do that, but I think it would be a bit quicker and a bit more efficient to ask people real questions that they understand, where they can give answers and then see how their answers relate.
But the answers are very coherent each year. I mean, you have always kind of the same percentage. So if it doesn't matter, it doesn't mean anything, why do the answers are quite the same every year and quite the same in every country? And they are quite, strong results in a way. That's the determinants are always quite the same.
Well, if it doesn't matter to you to ask questions that people don't understand, and because they always answer the same thing, you believe it's interesting, it's your position. But I still believe we could actually ask meaningful questions. And I think it matters when you go and you see, I don't know if you sometimes go and see how people answer questions to a questionnaire. Do you go and ask people? I've done that quite a lot. And I think it's a problem when you see that they actually don't understand your questions, and you still say, well, please pick up an answer. And they pick one. And you might say, okay, each year it's the same, so it doesn't matter. But I still feel a bit perplexed about that. Why don't ask a question they understand?
I think it depends on your research question. It's not an absolute question, like what you want to test.
Well, I really think you're done. You underestimate the impact of the fact that you can interpret a meaning, and this is what happened, and maybe because you're reading another literature, you're not aware of that. But a lot of literature is, and I think, I don't know, we will see what Michael Bruder will do tomorrow, but there is a lot of literature on interpreting the answer of people to Eurobarometer question as real answers. Well, what you say, it doesn't matter because it's always the same, so it means it has a meaning. We don't know which one, but we can do something with it. The problem is that lots of people, especially journalists and politicians, when they get aware of some of the answers, I know it's not everywhere, but some of them, and they interpret it as something where people would have given real answers to questions where we know it's not real. So but then let's go to the interest question and the fact that being a citizen means to be interested. I don't think so. I certainly don't think so. My PhD was about what it means to be a citizen in France, and I can tell you it's not being interested, that's for sure. But we still have a problem, I think, with the way things evolve in Europe. Well, I think social sciences have to be critical, and you might disagree with that, and it's perfectly all right. But I think we have to, in a way, and I don't think we can be very satisfied with the way things are evolving in Europe at the moment.
That's another question.
Well, no, it's just I'm just making a point, but I will. So I think part of the problem is that indeed, because people do not mobilize against what is happening, and so being interested in European citizenship is also being interested in what kind of political system can we construct where people would get interested and would mobilize in a way or another. I don't say it's a necessity. It's more something I would be happy to see. And just always looking for how people get effectively related to integration, I think, is a way of not trying to see how they could get mobilized by European integration. It's just say, well, if they like it, then they will support it. I don't want them to support it just to support it. I would like just to find a way to understand what kind of political system we are constructing. And what I know is from sociological work, I told you at the beginning, is that people would not get and vote if they don't feel in a way identified with the system. So does this mean that we are going in another age of democracy and electoral behavior and electoral mobilization, which was also part of the social of the European model, is something from the past, but in which case, what kind of system have we developed that could help citizens to be listen and to talk to the political system? That's part of my question, for instance. It's not anymore to do with Eurobarometer. But I don't think that what Favel says, I suppose the last book you mentioned, Sociology of Europe, I suppose, Sociology of European Integration. I know that Favel doesn't think so. As I said, and this is a conclusion of Eurostar and Eurocities, and this is also what they want to do with the Sociology of European Union and what he's doing with a new project with Ettore Recchi and Juan Diaz Medrano, is on the contrary to say, well, the political is not so important. What matters is how people develop relationship with others and how they change their behavior in, daily behaviors and how they got transformed with the process of European integration. So I don't think he would say what you believe he says. On the contrary, he's not interested in election at all. And I can understand, but the problem is if people don't vote, if they don't participate in political institutions, in political groups, in have any kind of collective action, we could say that the new age of democracy is consumer democracy. I'm not totally fanatical about it, but more interested in the process. It's having an interest in it because it opens new possibilities, new ways of action, I think. But it is new ways of action, I think. But you were absolutely right about the fact that I have mixed different messages, but I think with a lecture of 1 hour and something, you need to have more than one message. It's difficult to... Yeah, Marco.
Yeah, since you suggested that research should be innovative, I just have some open comments and questions. And correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't know literature on European identity so well. I focus more on national identities. But my observation is that one of the most trendy claims is that national identities are becoming Europeanized, which, I mean, partly I understand. I think I have my own interpretation of this claim, and I think it coincides with what I observe. But I was wondering whether this means that we are moving towards a European identity. I mean, if it's something that very pro-EU researchers try to say when they can't claim, obviously, that there is no European identity. And at the same time, always from basic observations that are not supported by any study, I also notice a counter trend in the last years, especially since the crisis started. In some EU member states, Europe as the EU is actually constructed as an other to strengthen national identities. And I saw this in my country recently with the national parliamentary elections. And this worked. One of the most successful parties, the party of the comedian Beppe Grillo, campaigned also with a referendum, with the proposal of holding a referendum on Euro membership, which was quite successful, with the idea that people could also have a say on leaving the European Union. And interestingly, this happened in a country that was always very pro-EU. And I'm curious to see next year when we have elections for the European Parliament, what the discourse will be about as well. But this was definitely a dominant discourse, and it concerned a national topic, a national approach to Europe. Then another, the second question I have was, so European identity, it's a bit what Jekyll was saying yesterday. Is it necessarily something positive? Is constructing European identity necessarily a good idea? Because identities often tend to be constructed by othering, and often the other is a negative one. So if we develop a European identity, it might also lead to conflicts, especially because we conceptualize European identity as something good. We think that because we are European, we are better, essentially, than Turks, Arabs, Russians. So this might also lead to conflicts with the external world, because, to make a comparison, I hope it's not too banal, but it's a bit like with the Schengen system. It's great if you're in, but if you're outside and you have to deal with these barriers, it's not so good.
Okay. Yes, what does it mean to say that national identities are Europeanized? I think I also wrote that. I'm not entirely sure. What we see, I think, so with being in any kind of indirect approach, we see so that anything that has to do with European something is low saliency, but when you get people to discuss things linked to European something, union, to Europe, they tend to mix being national and being European. And you don't see a clear-cut differentiation between the two. So I think this is what we tend to say. So it doesn't work with the UK, which is very different. And I think part of the difficulties is that in European studies that Americans or people working in America have quite an influence on the matter, and they usually enter Europe through the UK, which I think has an influence on the way all these things have evolved, the way we discuss these questions. So I think what we say with national identity are Europeanized is part of the influence of the Moreno question and the question that has been asked forever about do you feel you are more something or more European or more. And as we see that what actually increases or what is the bulk of anything to do with Europe is people saying I am both national and European, then we also tend to word it like that. But basically it's very difficult when people discuss European issues to make the difference between when they talk of themselves as being national and when they talk of themselves as being European. The two got mixed, I think. So I don't know if this is a trick of Europeanists to try to find something to say about the European nation, but I think this is what it means. But it's quite different in each country. So depending on the way the political system and the history of national citizenship, then it takes different ways to get Europeanized. Europe as the other and leaving the EU, that certainly is not what we got when we had our study in 2006. I think that's really something new with the crisis, that actually some countries might leave the European Union. We got exactly the opposite. Part of the indifference of people was also that it was considered a done deal that we were all in the European Union, and that things had happened and we could not go back. And suddenly it seems it's possible to go back. Except that negotiations between countries we would like to leave and the European Union are quite complicated. Because at the same time we tell them, well, we are not good enough for us, but don't leave. And we will give you money to stay, but you will pay very, very much for that. So I think it's a bit complicated. So I have no idea, not more than you, about these things, because it was absolutely not in the picture in 2006. That's a huge difference. The idea that the European Union could actually not break down, but at least some people, some countries could leave. We really had the opposite. The idea that, okay, we are hardly European, but our children will be European. Europe was in qualitative discussions always a question of the future. Okay, now we don't know precisely, but in the future we will all be European. And even with very odd ways of saying, well, it's not that we want to, but we will become European because it's what has been decided for us. So I think now the message which comes from the EU, if the EU has a message, I suppose it's more some government which have messages. It's more, I think, confusing. So I don't know. And European identity being something positive, well, I think I try to introduce that with the idea that banal nationalism is not a sweet thing. And I also think that, and Laura is using banal Europeanism, and I discussed that with her in different conferences. I think if she's using this, then it means it implies a very negative connotation. It implies the idea that we actually want people to become European because they want them to accept the system we built for them, because this is what is in banal nationalism, and banal nationalism is a charge, it's really a very negative understanding of, it's an ideology which is an ideology of exclusion. And so it goes back to the question of Caesarean citizenship. I think it's the idea that if we want, and I think it's what is a bit beyond this idea of European identity is, okay, we want to have our cohesion, but we don't want the others. So I perfectly agree, and I don't think it's a very good thing. But my problem is that, again, going back to political sociology, I don't think we know how to make democracy work without it. So it's just a paradox. I'm not in favor of any kind of, I would prefer us to be human beings, but we don't have a government at the level of humanity. So if we want to have any kind of democracy, meaning any kind of, it goes back to Cyril's question about being interested in any kind of power of the people, or any kind of involvement of citizens in government. If we don't have, but it's an empirical fact. I mean, any study I know about political participation, about electoral participation, the link between feeling identified with one's nation or the level of government and going to vote is extreme. People don't go and vote because they are interested. It's not for this reason that they go and vote. They go because it's their story. It goes back to Tilly's work. They go and they go and they choose something because they are part of the story of the people who are making a decision. So it's not rational. It's not really not being interested in the story. So, but we could say, and lots of people have said, democracy is a second choice. It's not a nice system. We know we didn't. I mean, we have not come out with a very nice democratic system. But this is the only one we know how to make working. So what should we do? And again, I think it's more. The question is more for you than for me, because. You will have to cope with this system. So it's more, no, it's not positive, but can we do without it? I'm not sure. Not yet. Yeah.
I actually have two questions. First of all, I do agree with you that the whole notion of European identity is problematic and that we should look for something else, something, innovative. And on the other hand, that indirect questioning, and implicitness is very important, and that we should stop, asking these questions which don't have a meaning to the people, actually. But even if you have indirect questioning in your qualitative research, aren't we still looking, even if we don't tell the people, we're still looking for their attitudes towards, the European Union and does it matter to you or not, even if you don't, pose the question directly. And I don't know, if we think about implicitness and if we assume that it exists and that it, there's something that is not actually, we can't see it, but it's there, that we should rather focus on comparative and possibly longitudinal studies that basically compare people's attitudes to specific issues, because people, they have attitudes to issues. They might not have, attitudes to the European Union, which is really much an umbrella term for so many little details and developments. So they might not care about the European Union. They might not be aware of the political system. But in some way, because there is, this community that is, really narrated through national elites and transnational discourse and media and whatever, that they somehow become similar without actually being aware of it. And we might not be actually aware of it because we don't have comparative data. So maybe we should start with very specific, issues. It might be like citizenship or immigration or whatever, or specific affairs, specific things that are very topical at the moment, and ask them about what they think of it, and then see if they have comparative, attitudes or not. Because I think we have to get over this divide between European issues and national issues, because I think for a lot of cases it's the same, or they're similar, or we frame supposedly domestic issues as European issues without knowing that we do. So in that sense, Europeanization of national identities is not really an additive process. You don't have like, I'm national, I'm a European, or there's national identity and European identity, but it's basically the same, or they're not added to it. There's not like this marble cake or Russian doll model or whatever, but they're like more infused, really, infiltrated, which is like a step, forward in that sense. So I was wondering if you would, agree with that, or and then I have another question that is actually related to a paper from yesterday, because you argued that that the people you interviewed do not actually trust their national elites anymore, that they don't think they can actually achieve something by being involved in the European Union. And on the other hand, they don't relate to the EU as a system. So both levels problematic for them. So what are we left with then if they can't relate to either of them? They don't trust the national elites and they don't trust the European Union, or they're not actually aware of it in the first place. So I was wondering if that's actually a very bleak picture and we could do about it. Thanks.
Well, first, I think there are so many things we could look at. So there is not one answer, and you can have lots of many different research questions, and that's lovely because you're all diverse and you will have all diverse research questions, and I think it was part of the mixed message. Have different research questions. Don't just repeat research questions that have already been studied, I think, too much already. I'm not sure I understood what you mean by comparative attitudes. Do you mean we should look in different countries and see if people do it? Well, it's basically, I think it's part of what Jonathan White wanted to do, and also what we tried to do. And it was interesting to see the way we did it with having this double comparison of because White didn't differentiate socially. He had these taxi drivers considering that they were more or less a milieu where there would be some kind of mixture of people discussing with them, and it could have a kind of general discourse of the society. So it's not socially, it's not a sociology of taxi drivers. It's more, he believes, because they talk to many different people, so they should be a kind of, transmitters of ideas within society. While we really felt sociology of people matters in this question of relationship to politics and to power. And doing this double comparison, it's interesting to see it works in both ways. So at the same time, we can actually compare working class people, employees, and executives in the three countries, and there is a general pattern, which is the same in the three countries, but the three countries are really different. And you can also put together workers, employees, and executive people from the same country and compare them to the other. So it's really, and doing qualitative research, you don't measure things, meaning you cannot weight, contrary to quantitative research, where you can weight an effect compared to another. We cannot do that with qualitative research, unfortunately. But both worked, so we could, yes, try really to have these comparative attitudes. I think, yes, when I said widen the angle, of course, we will not have 20 or 100 research projects with people just asking citizens, what do you think of the world, and trying to look if there is something with European identity in the story. It would be without interest. So have your research question, but and with some things that interest you. But what I think is useless is to keep asking people, what do you think of the European integration? So a lot of people are nowadays saying that what is interesting is to try to find out how people really experience the European Union. That's part of the Fabulous project, but many people say so. So try to find out in people's life what is related to European Union that they know or that they don't know. And possibly discuss with them when they don't know it's related to the European integration, that it might be. I mean, we can have a lot of ways of dealing with people, even in research. And you can have, if you keep it open at the beginning, trying to understand what kind of experience they have, and then introduce the idea that it might have to be with the European Union, and they don't know. What is massive is that people have little knowledge of how the work is actually evolving, and it's perfectly understandable because the world is complicated, and we also as scholars have little knowledge of it. So yes, I would say begin with any kind of research question and topic that is of interest to you, but then give, and this is what I call indirect questioning, always keep a possibility that people express things as they believe. And this is the discussion with Cyril with this, I think, stupid question of Eurobarometers, that give a possibility to just listen to the words they would use to account for how it matters to them or what matters to them. And then introduce what is of interest to you and see how it can relate, I think. But there are so many things we could do. And I think, yes, trust in politics is a big issue. Our groups, it's unbelievable. It's the amount of anger, distrust, irony, disgust about politicians and politics. It's not new. I mean, it's not that people 30 years before, 40 years before were enthusiastic about politics. And there have always been in democracies this relationship, which is a relation of partly distrust. But there was, I think, at least in the countries we've been inquiring, there was some kind of work made by political parties in order to mobilize people, in order to phrase things in such a way that people could believe they were part of the story. The feeling I have with the kind of discussion we've recorded is that there is nothing is left, apart from people who are politically really active. And for the manager, the story is very much a story of individual fate, but really not at all this feeling of being part of the story. It's all me, how I identify myself, what is my future, but it's my future. And the others is really apathy and anomie and distress and fear and threat. And, wow, I really thought it was tough. And I'm not sure we can see that so much from pre-constructed question, but maybe yes, just maybe I don't have the right reference. So I tend to believe that there is a huge work to do to try to understand more. Maybe it will just be the picture being worse and worse, and we're just at the age of a new revolution, and it will be your business to deal with that. Or maybe we don't really understand what people understand, and we don't really understand what is happening, actually. But if we keep to a kind of interrogation as we used to do about the relationship between citizen and political system, I think it's bad. I think it's very dark. Yeah, I really found this research project quite difficult. I mean, listening to the discussion, it was. And these people were really, it was interesting. They had lots of ideas about the world, but it was really, really dark.